This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and I'm joined today with Patrick Bond. He's a professor, political economist at the University of Johannesburg, and has been writing extensively on the economic development of Africa and globally, and the role of BRICS, the role of China in the development of Africa. Welcome to our show, Patrick.
It's great to be back with you, Steve. Wonderful, and warm greetings to you and your viewers and all the comrades who are in struggle for justice.
So, Patrick, let's start off by the development of investment, Chinese investment in Africa, and how that's changed and how it's become, with China becoming the largest exporter, the largest industrial nation in the world, what that effect has been in the continent of Africa.
You know, it's so good to be able to just have a nostalgic, progressive reflection on an older mode of not just foreign direct investment and trade, but infrastructure development, because I think of a Chinese solidaristic role when Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai were very committed to especially the weakest countries, and those included the British colonial and then neo-colonial victims of Tanzania and Zambia. So when the first big Chinese investment in Africa occurred in the 60s, it had followed the visit in 1963, going into 1964, of Zhou Enlai, and that was the Tanzam Railroad. It was a single railroad line, and it connected the Dar es Salaam port to the copper belt in northern Zambia. It was very important for Zambia to be able to diversify its exports, and it had been using first what was called Southern Rhodesia, and now Zimbabwe. But also those rail lines and roads went through Durban, South Africa. And so to be able to have a direct eastward rail line was a sort of an exemplary solidaristic project. This was based on, let me just very quickly tell you what these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that go back to 1954: mutual respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Then when Zhou Enlai met with first Kwame Nkrumah, he actually was with Nasser in Egypt. He'd gone to Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. But with Nkrumah, I think they developed these 8 principles that in the 63-64 trip allowed Zhou Enlai to set up what could be mutual benefit, no conditions attached, and then no interest or low interest loans, so as not to create a debt burden, to help the recipient nation develop its economy, not to create dependence on China, projects that need less capital, quick returns. In other words, unlike Western and neo-colonial regimes, this wasn't about profiteering. The aid in kind must be of high quality, and the technology can be learned and mastered by locals. Chinese experts and technicians working for the aid recipient country are treated equally with local ones with no extra benefits. So just think if you can go back 60 years to the point where there was a Chinese solidaristic relationship that didn't relate to a global value chain or to the world financial and commodity circuits. Those capitalist circuits, China had not really been integrated into, and it was only then in the early 2000s, with China's accession to the World Trade Organization, that we began to see a very, very different kind of predatory, extractivist, and parasitical and super exploitative kind of capitalist development. And unfortunately, there are many commentators out there who want to give China a bit of a break, because we know US imperialism is at the core of that world economy, and that what is produced from the African continent, typically your cobalt from Zambia, your lithium from Zimbabwe, it goes into the Chinese manufacturing facilities and then back to the West, and sometimes back to us. They often will have differentiated markets so that we don't necessarily get all the best quality material from China. But this is the point, isn't it? That instead of being a different, let's say, a manufacturing and industrial and labor-intensive project, the way China itself had begun to industrialize in the 2000s, what we're getting instead, with very clear examples in the labor sites like Ethiopia that become sweatshops, or in the extractive industries, or even in some of the manufacturing plants we can talk about here in South Africa, we get a very, let's say, amplified version of exploitation, and that is both unequal exchange of labor values and the extraction of raw materials that's uncompensated for. Those would be the quick stories of a great old nostalgia I have for what I know. I've been on that Tanzam site, and what I see when I see railroads in South Africa, coal-fired power plants, and extractive industries.
And of course, for US imperialism, Nixon, Kissinger, getting China to open up, join the WTO was seen as a great victory, and the transformation of China into a capitalist country that they could make great profits in, and which they have made great profits in the export of capital to China to develop their industries with US and European investment. But one of the things I saw when I was in Cape Town was the closure of the textile industry. That on joining the WTO, which was 20,000 workers, industrial workers, and completely wiped out the textile industry. And this process of deindustrialization, I mean, it was pretty apparent that WTO and China's entry into it really opened things up in Africa, in the South African economy.
No, that's right. If you check manufacturing to GDP, the crash really is occurring in much of the continent because of Chinese exports. But the process started really in the early 90s. Don't forget there was a debt crisis that meant most African countries that had inward industrialization strategies, that had stronger states capable of managing, let's say, a sovereign set of decisions about their economy and their society. Those were weakened by the IMF and World Bank. And in the early 90s, the flood of imports came as the bank and IMF included on its repayment conditionality that the tariffs and the protective, sort of cottage industry policies would be taken down. In South Africa, in other words, from the early 90s, not just clothing, textiles, footwear, appliances, electronics, vast swaths of our manufacturing base that was labor intensive in character, they were destroyed. And we had about 24% manufacturing to GDP just before apartheid ended in 1994, today down to 12%. Much of it, yes, Chinese glutted markets, let's call them, as many would see them, a crisis of capitalist overproduction that becomes quite acute by the early 2010s. The big international financial crisis lowers effective demand. Credit is pumped into the world economy. But to the extent that we would see, for example, China having a very powerful export economy already at the time of the world financial crisis, it then begins to go inward. But it does two things, not just internal, let's say, infrastructure development and a consumer market and credit beginning to bubble up. Now we see far too much of that over the last 15 years, the property market bubbling up so fast that it's really crashing. But also the Belt and Road initiative that was to, especially under the current president, Xi Jinping, to move that overaccumulated capital, the overproduction in the manufacturing sector out. So it isn't only trading of the goods that come from that sweatshop-based hoku, the migrant labor, apartheid-style, rural workers with very few rights to live in the city. And of course, that's changing a little bit, but still is the core of about 28% of the workforce in China. It's just like the Bantustans in South Africa, that apartheid style. But the crucial thing is that they then start moving their manufacturing to, well, all sorts of sweatshop sites. I mean, Vietnam and Bangladesh and even Ethiopia. Ethiopia went up from about 3% of its GDP being manufacturing up to 6%. But partly because of the civil war and the lack of balanced development, they've actually fallen back to 4%. So we didn't really see, certainly in South Africa, the expansion of our manufacturing base, what with the outflow of manufacturing capital, the going out, as they term it in China, in which we would have expected, like the US going out first to the maquiladoras of Mexico and then to the east coast of China, we would expect a sort of division of labor opening up. It seems to have stalled. And one reason is the excessive indebtedness Ethiopia went bankrupt at the end of last year, even though it was a very high growth economy in the 2010s. Same for Zambia, same for Ghana. And Chinese debt is part of it. It's only on average about 12%. So the vast bulk of the debt is still owed to Western financial institutions, some of the Euro markets. But I would stress what I saw in Kenya firsthand in late June, which was a rebellion, Gen Z, right? The kids of Kenya suddenly getting chopped with all these new fiscal squeezes, the new taxes, and they rebelled. And one of the reasons is that they've had mega projects from China. The big one in Kenya is the railroad. It goes from Mombasa on the port to Nairobi. It's meant to go all the way to Uganda, to Kampala. But that's let me call it a sort of excessive investment in an infrastructure for trading, for a typical neo-colonial arrangement. You set up a big new port, and in the case of Africa, we've seen a few ports coming up from China. Then you set up the road or the railroad or the bridges, and you're really looking ultimately for the mines and the fossil fuel fields and the minerals. And that's what you want to get out. And there's really no profound difference in that international division of labor going back 140 years to, if we were talking about Africa, then we'd be talking about what was happening in Berlin, where you could kind of carve up the continent by colonial powers, 5 big ones, Britain and France and Portugal and Germany and Belgium, and scramble for Africa, as it became known, and set up these 54, a few less, but now 54 countries with irrational borders. And China's investments haven't really broken out of that mold. There are a few exceptions, but I think I would add one thing that everybody tries to gloss over, which is that the new Chinese investments, especially financial capital, because they do come in with the China Development Bank, with the BRICS New Development Bank based in Shanghai. But what they typically will do is amplify the existing debt system. And when it relates to things like railroads, for example, South Africa's locomotives are coming from China South Rail. It's a tied loan. But those locomotives were done in the most corrupt way, Steve, and there's no dispute about it. About 100 major new locomotives designed especially for 3-kilometer long coal rail line, basically linked up trains. You take a 3-kilometer long coal train from the northern part of the country and the east side down to the Richards Bay port, and China became a major buyer again of South African coal. But the locomotives were done in a corrupt way, and so they're sitting idling, they're broken. The Chinese company, China South Rail, won't go back and fix them because they have a tax dispute. And then you have the biggest single act of corruption, which was 2 coal-fired power plants, in which, again, China Development Bank, BRICS New Development Bank are major lenders. So they really have an interest in what was ultimately a Tokyo firm, Hitachi, having bribed the ruling party in a case that even the United States prosecuted under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 2015 and got a payment from Hitachi, but isn't being prosecuted here. Those Chinese investments, the trade for the locomotives, the finance for the coal-fired power plants, are exemplary. And I'll have to just mention the most important, because we've just had FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and it revitalized the single biggest industrial project, which is Masina Makado in the Limpopo, and it's a special economic zone. So instead of paying a 27% corporate tax rate, you pay 15%, you get lots of other benefits. And the idea by the Chinese investor, who's kind of got a 99-year lease on it, Ning Yat Hoi, who was wanted by Interpol for corruption in Zimbabwe's largest gold mine, Frida Rebecca. So even when in 2017 he was given this contract, he really shouldn't have been. He should have been locked up. So he's been running with a new owner of a major coal company in northern South Africa, Limpopo province. And I've just been up there last week and was meeting with the lawyers around the major university there. And it's quite an extraordinary moment where we see a lot of, let's say, rhetoric finally beginning to see the point where reality may invoke what could be a $10 billion investment, the biggest industrial investment really in Africa. And yet all the contradictions, especially lack of water to cool coal fired processes like a smelter for ferrochrome. There was originally a 4,600 megawatt coal-fired power plant, one of the biggest in the world. That was taken off by Xi Jinping, who sort of put a sanctions on coal-fired power plants in the Belt and Road in 2021. But if I can go on and on about this particular project, I'm so fascinated by whether a special economic zone magnet, following the old Chinese model of setting up these sort of separate corporate districts without labor rights, whether that will actually ultimately take off. People are very desperate for some employment. Our unemployment rate is still about 44%, including those who've given up looking for work. And the major two Chinese industrial investments, two auto plants here in South Africa, a place called Kucha, a special economic zone. One is Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation, the other is First Auto Works. Since your labor listeners are wondering, well, do these First Auto workers have a union? They do, actually. The metal workers, a very, very strong union, and they've gone on strike because they were being paid about a third of the going wage. They haven't raised it too much beyond that. The other one, Beijing Auto Industrial, is only after now 7 years of being sort of online, having an assembly line, semi-knockdown kit, has only produced 300 cars. It's really just a white elephant. These are the sorts of reality stories. We could go to Namibia, which you've been to and seen the Rossing mine, where Chinese super exploitative extractive labor, Chinese attempt to move lithium out of Windhoek was stopped because it was so extreme. Then we have Zimbabwe, where I visited several of the Chinese mines last year. And the horror stories continue. DRC, child labor in the cobalt mines that we use for our phones and computers. Again and again, we would probably end up concluding, with maybe a few exceptions here and there, that the Chinese industrial expansion, the Chinese extractive industry, the Chinese infrastructure bill, the Chinese financing, and the deindustrialization caused by cheap Chinese products flooding local markets. It's a devastating role that China's played in Africa's economy.
And one of the important issues in Africa and in the United States, as well as contract labor and the privatization of the economy. And as you've been discussing, the privatization of the railroads, all kinds of things in South Africa, the privatization of Transnet, where they want to sell off the management of it to private capitalist companies. How has that affected the working class in Africa? And what's the role of Chinese investment in privatization and contract labor?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Transnet, because it is a curious case. I told you that there are locomotives that China had supplied through the Gupta family connections within Transnet in 2013 in a huge contract, $5-6 billion worth. Those were corruption riddled. And what that meant was that the export, especially of the big bulk, the main one, iron ore, that goes across the country to one of the western ports, Saldanha, but especially coal. So to give you an illustration of the breakdown of Transnet, once you have a parastatal, it has to be broken. Once it's broken, you sell it. That meant, for example, that what South Africa did is the 5th largest coal exporter in the world, 70 million tons a year. Because of the lack of locomotives, fell last year to 47 million tons. It's probably up about 50 million tons now. But this is a coal export terminal that can do 90 million. So that's the sort of degree to which capacity utilization is very low because of the corrupt Chinese locomotive systems that have fallen apart and can't be fixed because the Chinese company won't come back. Now that's let's say an excuse for then neoliberal managers coming in and privatizing. Regrettably, one of the things with the commercialization process already is a very weak trade union, which used to be, as you remember from hearing about the 1973 dock workers' strike against Transnet, was the most powerful upsurge of labor, maybe between then and the Marikana platinum workers that led to a massacre in 2012. So if you recall, in 1973, those workers, thanks to fantastic local organizers, and there was one intellectual from the University of Natal who stepped in to do labor support, named David Hempson. And with that extraordinary power that workers suddenly found that they would put hundreds of ships way out into the ocean, waiting to come in and dock. And you could stand up at the University of Natal, as Dave Hempson did, and you look out and you could kind of feel the muscle of labor by just seeing the hundreds of ships way out. And I saw that last in 2010. You remember we hosted the World Cup of soccer, and the workers in, again, SATAU, South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, wanted a higher pay for bringing in all the goods associated with the World Cup, and they went on strike just before the games began. And of course, it was a really good moment to strike, to be able to sort of say, well, let's let's use our maximum power, and they did get major gains. Since 2010, this commercialization and privatization process has really wrecked a great many of our parastatal trade unions. So it's not just in Transnet, the biggest one, NUMSA, had worked very hard in the coal-fired power plants, and those are being shut down, I think, for good reason, for the climate catastrophe. And there should be, obviously, for these NUMSA workers a chance to do a just transition. I might add that Jane McLevy, the late great organizer, had done a lot of work with NUMSA to try to figure out that. They never quite got it, and they ended up being pro-coal. NUMSA also has a pro-Russia and pro-BRICS policy that has been, I think, coinciding with the ways in which they've moved from independent socialists to a position more associated with the international left that supports China as socialist and Russia as anti-imperialist, a position I don't think you and I would have much time for. But let's put it this way, Steve, the degradation of the labor movement through the structural changes in the economy, privatization, commercialization, and parastatals, but all public sector workers getting hit. I should just add that this week we suffered the death of Tito Mboweni, who used to be a minister of labor, who in 1994, the first Democratic minister, did provide a progressive labor legislation, the Labor Relations Act, that gave more power to striking workers. And but gradually that was reversed. Mboweni, who died after a trip to Ghana, suddenly age 65, had become, by the late 90s, a core neoliberal figure. He'd gone from a sort of center-left labor ministry position to central bank governor. And in his death, and in all of the discussions about what his role here had meant over the last few days, it's that, let's call it a kind of shift away from the power of labor. And it was, I think, witnessed most dramatically when he simply broke the 3-year contract at year 2, and he refused to give public sector workers their pay increase due in early 2020. He'd also, at the very point where he gave us a budget, cut a huge chunk, about at that point, about $500 million from the health budget, even though COVID was coming down like a train on us. And everybody knew that in February 2020. So let's say it's a balance of forces in which the shift broadly against the power of labor, the fragmentation of the labor movement, and the gig economy coming up, and huge swaths of industry just being wiped out, means that our workers are going to have to double their efforts now, especially where it comes to SATAU, the transport worker union, and anybody really involved in contesting for what should be their basic rights. One last point on the commercialization. I do think the Chinese play a very pernicious role. I mean, the worst place to support a port would be Haifa port in Israel. And that port, not only Adani from India, but Shanghai Port Corporation, a parastatal from China. Those privatized ports, but basically it's a large, long port in Haifa, the main port of Israel, have been under the microscope because the insurance costs of moving in and out of those ports are very high. And once Hezbollah does finally actually hit the port, you'll see it just closes probably, and all the shipping goes to Ashdod. But the Chinese privatization of Haifa, another case like the $20 billion of trade between China and Israel, including coal imports from Israel to Israel from China. Those are some of the indications that Chinese foreign economic policy is only based on greed and not on the principles of solidarity with Palestinians.
And you have the situation in Namibia where Chinese companies, public companies, have taken over Rosing mine and also Husab mine, which is the second largest uranium mine in the world, fired the union leaders, subcontract the work and to subcontractors, and then basically increase their profits by getting rid of regular mine workers in the mine workers union, and then bribe the mine workers union leadership and create a situation where workers are going back to an old contract labor system that existed under apartheid in Namibia and South Africa. And this effort to break the unions, is that a plan of capital investment in China? Because the arguments of those who say that China is developing Africa with these investments, the BRIC investments and the development bank, is that they're actually helping the country. But it seems if you bust the unions and bring in contract labor and also import Chinese workers in some cases to do work that Africans can be done, while in Namibia and other countries, it really is destroying the labor conditions of African workers.
Well, I saw that personally. You've seen it in Namibia. Most of my experiences in a setting which you could call greenfield, not taking over an existing mine like Rossing and reversing labor and independence movement gains, but going into areas where in Zimbabwe they're trying to build a 5 million ton a year steel mill. It's called Dimson, and it's in the middle of the country. It's just north of the sort of center point, which is called Mashvingo, where there's great traditions of settlement that go back over 1,000 years. Now, that particular case, where I witnessed in a trip with the Center for Natural Resource Governance last year, that particular case indeed did suggest that there was a lot of construction work going on, building the rudimentary worker housing and some of the mine work. It's a big iron ore mountain in which Dimson is putting a big steel mill. Could certainly have been done by the workers. And I remember seeing huge numbers of people lining up to get jobs there, but also at another place just about 2 hours away in Zimbabwe called Bikita. It's the largest lithium mine in Africa. And what my colleague there, Farai Maguwu, talking to the workers, again, huge long queues of expecting very sort of gig economy type opportunities for desperately poor people. And they weren't getting these jobs. They were just lined up and the wage rates were incredibly low, just at sort of $1 a day level. But what then you could feel was that the extraction process wasn't just surplus value from these workers, but it was the uncompensated raw materials. So very valuable lithium just being pulled out on vast trucks. They ripped up the big highway that goes from that area, Bikita, up to Mutare, the main eastern border town, and then over to Beira port. And I mean, I've never driven on a road, Steve, with more potholes than that old highway. And I used to drive that, sort of 10 times a year, that highway. So it does strike me that they haven't got the balance right in a place like Zimbabwe, where the Chinese are alleged in 2017 to have helped the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, and his vice president, named Augustino Chiangwa, to actually run a coup against Robert Mugabe. And Mugabe had just the year earlier said that the diamond mine that China had a major investment in through their company Anjin, one that I'd been visiting on and off for 15 years, called Marangi, the biggest diamond field since here in South Africa, Kimberley was discovered in the 1870s. But that diamond outflow angered Mugabe. He said, just on his, I think it was his 88th birthday, I can find the exact year, but it was in 2016, he said, we had $15 billion of diamonds and we only got to $2 billion in revenue. Where'd the 13 billion go? And it was, because he was looking east. He was so desperate because Western imperialism had put on sanctions. So he thought that by bringing in this Chinese company, but it was profoundly corrupt. There are a few other examples of mines I visited then with the Center for Natural Resource Governance. We're monitoring the Chinese drilling of all of Zimbabwe. The same situation in Zambia, copper, and especially the Eastern DRC. What worries me there, and I can mention just two other related to fossil fuels, also in the region that are terribly important, but in the Eastern DRC, it's a real civil war. And the Rwandan government is backing some of the rebels. And the South African National Defense Force has just put 3,000 troops in, essentially to defend a status quo that's based profoundly on child labor and on this extraction process with no reinvestment. If I go a little bit further up from Eastern DRC just across the main lake where there's oil underneath, Lake Albert, Total is set up with China National Overseas Oil Corporation, CNOOC, the East African crude oil pipeline. They're just getting it built now. They're getting the financing, including from South Africa, and that is full of exploitation and contestation and human rights abuses, as the dictator in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, and Tanzanian authorities are arresting young activists. We just go a little bit further south. My last case to toss at you is the China National Petroleum Corporation in league with ExxonMobil to take the so-called blood methane, the methane gas, in a bloody civil war zone, Cabo Delgado, in Mozambique, where 6,000 have died, 1 million displaced, and to extract that. And Total is, of course, the company from Paris without any ethics and morals and full of corruption and climate catastrophe contributions. And they've just announced yesterday that they will take some of that blood methane and bring it to Johannesburg in a brand new pipeline. And so we have to kind of think about, why do they want to bring that gas here? And it's because we have 2 or 3 major customers, including Sasol, where they squeeze that gas to make a few drops of petroleum, the old Nazi Fischer-Tropsch method of taking these chemical compounds and using massive amounts of energy to squeeze gas, to squeeze coal. You get a few drops of petroleum, of liquid gas. We could have imported that just as easily. And the result is the #1 CO2 emissions hotspot on the planet, Secunda, about 2 hours away from here. Now, that to me is a whole set of, and I call it a global value chain, in which the Chinese company, CNOOC, CNPC, Sinomines, and Bakita, I could go on and on about all of these extractive industries. And then they connect their infrastructure to get like a pipeline or a railroad or bridges and roads. And they get that out and they put it into a world economy which is suffering from all manner of uncosted environmental liabilities and super exploited labor processes. And to me, this represents China as an amplifier of, may I call it, global uneven and combined development, or just the awful capitalist crisis riddled suicidal system that we are suffering. China's really the cutting edge. We're going to see the BRICS meeting October 22 to 24. So I can toss a few things at you, Steve, that are not going to be on the meeting, including the global value chains, including China's role in the multilateral institutions, WTO, IMF, World Bank, and especially the UN FCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The big polluters from the BRICS, it's not just the China, #1 emitter, although not historically, of course, that's US, not per capita, but of course doing a lot of, let's say, outsourcing of the US and Europe's emissions by producing there and then giving us the kind of laptop I'm talking to you on. And that process I'm most worried about, because it does show, I'm going to use 2 terms you'll know, imperial, sub-imperial fusion in the climate negotiations. Because frankly, when you go to Copenhagen, you see the Chinese leader, Wen Jiabao, with Lula, with Jacob Zuma from South Africa, with Manmohan Singh, the then Indian prime minister. And you see them dealing with Barack Obama. And when you hear Barack Obama and you see what he writes about it in his autobiography, I think it was in his 2012 autobio, and he sort of says, no, it was a 2020, anyway, his autobio of 2020. He says, that was some gangsta shit you just pulled, quoting his bodyguard, Reggie Love. And he said, yes, I did feel rather proud, because what he'd done was something that exists to this day, a fusion of the interests of high pollution, never admitting you committed emissions, climate debt or reparations or liability, and then privatizing the air through carbon markets. Those are the key things that bring the BRICS and especially China together with the West, which is why under these conditions, we're just not going to make progress on the climate catastrophe and the biodiversity crisis.
And the argument of these supporters of China and BRICS is multilateralism. You've got to have a competition between the United States, US and European imperialism, and the rest of the world. It sounds from what you're saying that actually this competition isn't benefiting the world economy, the climate, that in reality it's adding to the crisis. Is that the case?
Yes, the rhetoric, as you say, is that there's a multipolar alternative to the unilateral United States-led imperialist system, Let me use one very eloquent speaker, Vijay Prashad and his Tricontinental Institute, have a name for this, hyper-imperialism, in which there's no sub-imperialism, there's no partnership to be discussed. It's simply US military power. And it's a very impressive collection of arguments that the Tricontinental Institute put out against the Pentagon, right, and associated power players in military imperialism. But that's not all the imperialism we have to worry about. It's not that there's a multipolar as advertised. It's not that there's an anti-imperial project. It's that there's an assimilation. So the best example of that is what we saw in September last year in India, and that we'll see in November in Rio de Janeiro and here in Johannesburg next year, the G20. So the G20 is the old G7. 2008, they needed to expand it to get more money to bail out Western banks, especially US banks, and all of the criminality associated with Goldman Sachs and the mortgage-backed security scandals and the ripping off of black homeowners. All of that needed to have Saudi Arabia, China, some of the other G20 countries that had big surpluses. And when they came together as G20, I could really feel that, for example, the man running the Fed at the time, Ben Bernanke, could smile because he could run printing presses. He could do quantitative easing without fear there would be some sort of reaction because all these G20 countries were in it. So the best example, Steve, of what the proponents of Chinese and Russian and maybe a few other countries' roles in the world economy will be is de-dollarization. And there's a myth making about it associated with a great deal of hype. All you have to do is type in de-dollarization in your YouTube and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of videos of gold bugs, people trying to sell you gold or some other way to protect your assets because of the crash of the dollar, right? So we've been hearing this quite a while, and I saw it quite close up here in Johannesburg when the BRICS met in August of 2023. So they had this big meeting, but before the heads of state met, there was a BRICS Business Council, and to sort of highlight that particular moment where the heads of state had come and they were listening carefully, the man running Standard Bank, South Africa's biggest bank, where we go out with the Extinction Rebellion and the other activists and protests nearly every week. And the man heading that bank, Sim Tshabalala, working with our Reserve Bank governor, Lesego Kganyago, very neoliberal, working with an ex-Marxist, ex-trade unionist, he ran NUMSA for much of the 1990s, Enoch Godongwana, they all three said, no de-dollarization. And the essential reason is that our Western gaze of the financial district here in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is typically the world's most overvalued, the Buffett indicator of capitalization to GDP, that is all oriented to the West. It's so bad, Steve, that even the BRICS New Development Bank is so westward gazing from its Shanghai headquarters with a president named Dilma Rousseff, formerly a guerrilla Marxist fighter against the Brazilian dictatorship, and then the Brazilian president until she was impeached in 2016. So she's the head of the BRICS New Development Bank. But even that bank, as a reflection of the power circuitry in the BRICS, they look not to the rest of the BRICS, they look to the three credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's. And that meant that on March 4, 2022, just after Putin had done this illegal invasion of Ukraine, and Janet Yellen had decided to get all the Western, financial power she had, including basically theft of between 300 and 600 billion, you hear different figures, of dollars of Russian state and oligarch assets. And, you could make a good case, I think, that, okay, they should pay up, they should pay reparations for wrecking Ukraine, killing 500,000, however many Ukrainian working class people. And I think the debate then is, well, what would the BRICS Bank do? And believe it or not, March 4, they basically put a statement out. You can see it on their website, and they keep repeating it. We won't lend to Russia. They do the so-called sort of road shows in which they try to sell BRICS Bank securities. They issue bonds to Western markets. And if you look at those PowerPoints on the BRICS New Development website, on that bank's website, you see they're absolutely clear. We're not lending to Russia. So they have Russia, a 20% owner at that time, right? 20%, 5 BRICS members each having the same share. of the BRICS Bank, and they won't loan to it. That's, as Prabhat Patnaik, the great Indian Marxist, put it, that's what you've got to watch. What are the big bourgeoisie within the BRICS capitals, the financial capitals? What are they doing? And they're not going with de-dollarization. And if you want to look at the BRICS supporting the International Monetary Fund, the major new investments, the recapitalization of the IMF comes from the BRICS. And the IMF hasn't changed one iota in its brutal neoliberal policies. There is no alternative BRICS to the IMF. There was supposed to be a contingent reserve arrangement and never emerged. Countries like South Africa, I mean, my students literally go hungry because of the budget cuts that the IMF imposed with a $4.3 billion loan that the late Tito Mboweni arranged in 2020. Anyway, I could go on because there's so many things if you wanted to essentially work against the power of the dollar, the extreme corruption in the Fed by its quantitative easing, its printing, its bailouts of its own banks, its deregulatory approach. If you wanted to, you put on tougher exchange controls. I mean, China's done that when they've faced massive outflows of capital, 2015-16. You could set up a genuine new bank, which is what Hugo Chavez tried to do in the Bank of the South, Banco del Sur. And he had some very talented technocrats like Pedro Paez from Ecuador, really designing a different kind of institution. The Brazilians at that point killed it, as Pedro will openly tell you. And I think if you look at the complete failures of these BRICS alternative institutions, CRA doesn't exist. BRICS New Development Bank is a really pathetic institution with lots of corruption in its lending. Nearly every loan here in South Africa would qualify, I would argue, as corrupt. And I've made that case in print. And if you look at all of this, Steve, you don't find that multipolar agenda. You find an assimilation into Western circuits of financial capital and basically promotion of the Western model. And if you talk about the way in which, say, South Africa treats its wretchedly poor neighbors going through the worst drought, I would just add, I mean, that really worries me the most. I'm sure you and your children, your grandchildren would think, what are the BRICS doing about the climate catastrophe? Well, those 10 countries, I'm going to add Saudi Arabia, it's probably going to join unless Trump wins, and then, maybe not. So Saudi Arabia and 3 other new countries, that is Iran, major oil producer, UAE, completely addicted to its oil and gas exports, Egypt, also strong on gas, and the fourth being Ethiopia, which doesn't have fossil fuels, a very wretched, poor country, went into default last year. And you kind of put these 10 BRICS plus together, you get 29% of GDP, but 51% of global emissions. Now that to me just says why we're not going to see the BRICS charting a new path based on any alternative approach that's humane, based on care for future generations, on planetary salvation, but instead very greedy, very destructive forces in their bourgeoisies. What we really need then is an alternative. We call it BRICS from below, where we're just hoping more resistance movements rise. For example, to Lula in Brazil. There's a left that supports him, obviously, but environmentalists are saying, but Lula, why are you going to drill with Petrobras where the Amazon River hits the Atlantic Ocean? Why did you just send Petrobras to South Africa to drill at the border of Namibia and South Africa offshore? This is the sort of, let me call it, schizophrenia that you get from Lula. I met him once, I don't know if I told you, Steve, but in 1989, when I was a Pacifica reporter, I said to him, hey, you've just come, I was in Washington at the time, you've just come, Mr. De Silva, from the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. What did you tell them? And as you know, he has a finger that was cut off in a machine accident when he was a metal worker. And he said to me through his interpreter, well, I told them if they don't give us their rings, we will chop off their fingers. Well, I like this Lula. He's really got a great spirit. He knows what the Brazilian bourgeoisie, the American multinationals, he knows what they need to hear. Of course, he didn't get elected president in 1989. His first round, he only was, I think, in 2002. And then he changed so dramatically that I think Brazilian sub-imperialism, the term actually comes from a Brazilian, Rui Mauro Marini. We'd look back, Marini would probably shake his head and say, why didn't this comrade learn?
And one of the things that China has argued, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. I heard that in Namibia. Namibian SWAPO was saying socialism with Namibian characteristics. But now you have a situation of overproduction in China, and also this global competition with US imperialism putting on tariffs, the Europeans. It sounds like the forces of overproduction and are driving the world capitalist economy towards war, imperialist war, that they have no solution within the framework of capitalist production. Is that the case in this overproduction crisis?
Yes, well, I've learned a lot from Chinese Marxists exactly about that. They kind of, giggle when they hear, socialism with Chinese characteristics, because the core, even if there are good parastatals that provide all sorts of infrastructural services, if the state does occasionally come to the rescue of its citizens under severe constraints. I witnessed that in China about a year or so ago in Yinxian, where very impressive programs near the Mongolian border were underway. I spent that week partly with Justin Lin, who is the World Bank chief economist and one of China's maybe most prestigious bourgeois economists, and would regularly ask him, what are you comrades doing to do this socialism with, and not on hukou, the migrant labor, and not on de-dollarization. It couldn't get anything progressive out of Justin Lin. Well, not unexpectedly. But for the Marxists, and I'll mention just one, I mean, there are plenty. I connect a lot to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and they have a Marxism Institute there. They even trained from there. I think that was Chen Anfu. He trained Xi Jinping at one point. But they're very limited in what they can say. So at Johns Hopkins, the one I'll mention, Hofeng Hong, is really the most eloquent in exactly identifying the overaccumulation of capital, just like Karl Marx did in sort of central contradiction, that is overproduction. And then you get this extreme uneven development. And the extent to which the fragility, it's not just the crash of their big real estate developers, and of course they have their banking system under state control, so they're not going to lose that. But it's when capital flight from an unpatriotic bourgeoisie gets extreme. So I witnessed that when I was there in 2015, and the stock market was crashing, and they 2016 the same. They put on exchange controls to stop that. So that was impressive. They banned cryptocurrency. I like that. I think that cryptocurrency is a real cancer. It's it's devastating. Then they did one other thing that was very curious and hit me in my own pocketbook, because an investor here, NASPER's leader, Koos Becker, put about $35 million in 2001 into an obscure company run by a young charismatic named Pony Ma. Not Jack Ma from Alibaba, but Pony Ma. And he started with that 35 million, nearly half of the capital, Tencent. It's now the biggest company in Asia. And the reason is it combines a Facebook and a Twitter and a sort of Amazon type of functioning, and it's called WeChat, and it's an exceptionally powerful part of their surveillance system. They have the so-called social credit. Well, my stock market investment, I don't put any myself, but my pension managers at the university do. And that really crashed in 2018 for an interesting reason, that the Chinese government said, Pony Ma, you're bringing in Tokyo software to poison our kids' minds. This video gaming and all these kind of apps you're bringing, stop that now. And you're under, well, they put Jack Ma under arrest at Alibaba, and then they really told Pony Ma, stop that. So my investments shrunk by about a third within a few months. So those are the sorts of controls that say that you could say, yeah, there's a sort of Chinese socialism that's looking after its own masses, but it does occur in a communist party with 80 billionaires in a way that I don't think necessarily reflects a genuine socialist approach. While Xi Jinping can talk about restoration of nature, which he's been doing, and modernization in a progressive way, and the state is very powerful, it doesn't strike me that there's anything that turns over the means of production to the working class. It doesn't strike me that they're internalizing the huge externalities, that is the pollution, and especially CO2 emissions. And finally, if you're an ordinary worker in those East Coast factories, the Foxconn is the most notorious. You're jumping out buildings, you're really under a hukou migrant labor system, basically equivalent, without the race factor, to the apartheid migrant labor system that puts the reproduction onus on the women back in the rural area to provide the cheap labor, who then come home on holidays but have no rights to live in the city. Then we're talking serious super exploitation, right? And that, to me, even if it's changing gradually, it's still at the core of this basic problem. Capitalism is out of control in China, and overproduction is just one of these terrible symptoms that reflect, I would say, a role in the global division of labor. I agree with many who sort of study this. This is not Chinese imperialism, because they're still victims to the real corporate powers that own the research and development, that take the patents and the copyrights and all of the money back to New York City, to London, to the headquarters sites of global capital, that use China as, kind of a useful factory.
But isn't China itself an exporter of capital? They bought banks in South Africa. They play a role in the world banking system. Isn't that part of the development of imperialist power?
Yes, yes. Well, I did mention Standard, the biggest bank in Africa, the most destructive. As I say, deserving big protests. They've had to put up a big fence around their headquarters in central, in the Rosebank area. The dilemma, though, Steve, is what do you do to measure? So some imperialists that take their money abroad were extremely successful. Others weren't. And it's a very interesting question to ask, like, will China ever recoup these Belt and Road investments? Now, the way you'd want to measure it is the flows of capital that come in, profits, dividends, interests, that are remitted back to the headquarters, versus those that go to the West. And when you do those calculations, as I've tried to keep up with, and may change a little bit, it does turn out that China is not getting a return on that export of capital that puts it into the category of imperialist. So what countries' economies can claim to be imperial? Well, of course, the US and Britain and Holland, and there are a few others in the Western core. And they're over 100%. So China is still only at 20% the last time I checked. Even South Africa, with our huge export of capital, that is vast amounts of our stock exchange that sort of relocated to London through Anglo-American and the big insurance companies and all the rest. And we're at 45%. So in those ratios, in other words, if you're looking at sort of the flows of capital that are moving around, and also the fact that China hasn't taken leadership in imperialist institutions, right? The best it could do was what Justin Lin had, the chief economist position, relatively, meager in its power at the World Bank. I've never seen the sort of grabbing of a major institution. You could say, well, A.J. Banga, who's the World Bank president, is Indian, but actually he's totally assimilated into New York. He was the head of Citibank, of MasterCard. You could argue that there are potentials for major third world figures to run imperialist institutions. The leader of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, is a Nigerian. She had been number 3 in the World Bank for some of her career, and the Nigerian finance minister, extreme neoliberal. But I just don't see that sort, let's say, of inter-imperial power balance. I see imperial institutions, the multilaterals, and I see China just fitting in as a second-rate, set of personnel and contributing money.
Well, you do have an inter-imperialist rivalry, and the effort of the European United States to surround Russia, break up Russia, take over the wealth of Russia, and their rivalry with China. And although China is now, you argue, is not a control of financial investment, the reality is they've captured large amounts of the resources of the world. In Namibia, they control all the uranium mines. I mean, they've taken over a lot of the resources of Africa as a result of their investment. Doesn't that change the nature of China as a power in relationship to the world economy and capitalism?
Well, it certainly does. You're right. When you look at China and its role in our region, which is quasi-imperial. But I'd still go back to, let's say, that central question. Is there, as Lenin posed it, an inter-imperial characteristic in which these major powers and their hinterlands, China and Africa, are in contestation? Or is there something more pernicious? What Rosa Luxemburg thought of when she explained imperialism in her 1913 book, The Accumulation of Capital, which Lenin hated, by the way. I mean, it's an interesting debate. I had a sort of chance to look back at Lenin's critique of her when I was talking to the Lynx editor not long ago. But the main point is, when Luxemburg thought that imperialism wasn't necessarily just a bunch of 5, 6 European powers battling it out, she saw something bigger and I think much more durable: capital meeting the non-capitalist, and as she put it, eating it up. So the capital non-capital relation gets more extreme under conditions of broad-based capitalist crisis. She put that very clearly. The overproduction problems in Western powers mean that they're looking for a scramble for Africa by the 1870s, 1880s. So if that's the case, then I'm thinking, so where is this overproduction and what are the manifestations? And there, it might seem like an inter-imperial rivalry, but really what we're seeing is China overproducing massively and the West in a very defensive mode trying to stave off devalorization. Now that means the West also is overproduced in batteries, in solar panels, in electric vehicles. Those are the three where the tariffs just hit in Europe, 45% or 100% in the US. But what's really going on, Steve? First, any human being will say, guys, you're not overproducing, you're underproducing. We need to put solar panels on everything and get off all fossil fuels. We need electric vehicles, not petrol and diesel. We need to have batteries, and hopefully we get better, less invasive batteries than lithium, sodium ion, or maybe we'll start using pumped storage or green hydrogen cells. We might find better uses. But the basic point is that for capitalism, the overproduction problem that we see in China is, if you take an eco-socialist standpoint, not a real problem. It's just that the problem is that it's for profit and the market isn't there. So above me are 6 solar panels. I've got a 5 kilowatt inverter and battery sitting around the corner. I'm sure my homeboy here, Tesla owner Elon Musk, had something to do with all of this. Yeah, apologies. He was very badly trained in Joburg, as all white boys are. Now, the dilemma for that sort of, let's say, overproduction is that we need everybody to get these. But for me, I paid $7,000. That's a lot. I'm in the top probably 5% of income earners as a petty bourgeois academic. But we desperately need to somehow decommodify and to call solar panels a global public good. To me, Steve, that's where all of this ultimately has to go. Whether you want to call China imperialist, or I would say sub-imperialist, because they're still, in a sense, their own victims within the global power system. They're still basically overproducing to a capitalist market that won't give us the solar and the EVs and the batteries that we desperately need to avoid a planetary breakdown. So in so many ways, Steve, we are not seeing China, let's say, advance a politics like providing the solar panels at affordable rates, washing out, if need be, the US solar producers and just making them free, smuggling them in, getting them everywhere. We're seeing internecine capitalist battles. If those become real inter-imperialist warfare, such as the South China Sea, or the battle over Taiwan, or becomes maybe along Central Asia the great sort of battleground of maybe India, China, in the Himalayas. These are all extraordinarily dangerous sites. Then I may have to revise. But at this point, I see China actually playing a relatively restrained role in those inter-imperial terms, and therefore just trying to fit into global capitalism.
Well, I agree with you that China wants peaceful coexistence, wants to fit in with US imperialism, wants to be part of this world imperialist system. The problem is that US imperialism is desperate, is becoming more and more adventurous, is in decline. Trump coming to power will lead to an escalated decline of US imperialism because of the internal crisis in the United States, the civil war or conflicts going on. So these are the conditions actually that lead to imperialist war, inter-imperialist rivalry, whether China wants it or not. And I see that as a great danger. I mean, I agree with you. The working class, the people of the world, need to take control of the organization of the world economy so you can get solar for everyone, so you can end the climate crisis, or control the climate crisis, or try to control the climate crisis. But the reality is that we're going off the cliff. I mean, the United States, these hurricanes, the refusal to reorganize the economy against further fossil fuel. I mean, these wars are adding to the climate crisis. The wars in the Middle East and the potential war against China. So I think that those are the dangers that are escalating really out of control because of basically the internal crisis of capitalism globally.
Oh, absolutely. And the dilemma then is, where will resistance emerge to cool the planet down and get working class agency to the point we can see some sort of revolutionary potential. And even if it's revolutionary as a threat, and you get some sort of radical social democratic reforms, that could include a rapid move to a green economy. And certainly the choice of Trump versus Harris is crystal clear: fascism versus neoliberal corporate power. And the neoliberal corporate power behind Harris isn't just the core role in the axis of genocide supporting Israel, but it's, as she was very open about in her debate, promoting fracking in Pennsylvania. I lived in Pennsylvania, 7 or 8 years. I was at Swarthmore undergrad and Penn before Elon Musk and after Trump at Wharton School. And you just think, wow, if it's going to boil down to that state, what a tragedy that that state is itself so screwed up with fracking, and that she is kowtowing to those interests. And I don't think she, nor with Biden and his approvals of drilling, have any intention. And it's so sad that Jill Stein's candidacy can't actually make any dent in this context. And in a place like Pennsylvania, one I suppose just hopes that Harris pulls through and ekes out some sort of victory so we can go to the next stage of a struggle. The problem, of course, is that as Obama showed, that would just lead to a demobilization of her support base, that very hyperactive group that was so glad to see Biden step down. And whether those be trade unionists who might relax their guard, or environmentalists who, like Obama days, gave them too much of a pass. We'll have to do much more in our parts of the world, I think. You were here in Johannesburg, Steve, and you could feel, I think, the general frustration. And we just had South Africa go to the International Court of Justice to say that Israel's committing genocide. So we began to see let's say, at least the performative characteristics of a liberation movement that meant what it was saying, at least at the level of the legal rhetoric. And then the terrible news here, just in the last couple of weeks, that as Colombia put on sanctions against Israel on coal, and Gustavo Petro, the great president there, said, no more coal for this genocide. Well, the number one to take its place was Russia, but now South Africa has overtaken Russia to become the number one coal supplier. And at the Richards Bay port, partly because we have so little yank with the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, the trade unions give us good rhetoric, but we haven't seen them really move, including the National Union of Mine Workers that digs out the coal and gets it onto those rail lines with the trucks that take it to the shipping sites. And then it goes around the west side of Africa because it can't go through the Suez Canal and Red Sea, thanks to the Houthi disruptions. And it lands in Hadera. And we've just seen, I think, 4 major shipments of about 165,000 tons go from South Africa to fuel the genocide. It's just so heartbreaking. Anyway, but at least we have some struggles going. We had a great protest about a week ago against the whole energy complex that's so addicted to coal. But to be frank, we have to do something more revolutionary, because our president used to be the main partner of Glencore, the number one company supplying coal to Israel. And his brother-in-law, Patrice Motsepe, has taken over that role in putting the coal out of the mines in about 100K to the east of here and getting it out to the Israelis. So we have a lot of big fights.
And of course, you have Israel with being allowed by the ANC to buy Clover, the largest dairy company in South Africa, by the Wertheim family, the billionaire Wertheim family, which has farms in Palestinian territory, which producing milk and then shipped back to South Africa, so that they're actually contributing to the apartheid regime directly by their investments in South Africa. And you have Zim lines still shipping in South Africa and many other ports around the world. But there has been a development with Vavi and Softu taking on BRICS and calling for action for the Palestinians. What happened at that presentation, and what's going on with the Softu Trading Federation?
Well, it's unfortunately a lot of stress, internal stress and fractures, which I don't quite understand. But I did talk to one of the key SAF2 executives today. His name, Mametwe Sebe, and he is the president of the GUWUSA, General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. And they are the ones that represent Clover workers. And he was very clear, we're going to keep the Israeli piece of the struggle there. at the highest level of visibility. As for Vavi, probably Africa's greatest trade unionist. I don't think many would dispute that. He has various problems in running both the Congress of South African Trade Unions and SAFTU, problems associated with internecine battles for power, but also sexual harassment charges. But I think what he's done in a major presentation, you can find it on their Facebook page, and it's SAFTU as South African Federation of Trade Unions. On Saturday, in one of the provincial cities, Potchefstroom, made an impassioned speech that at this October 22 to 24 BRICS summit, that we become aware that the BRICS connections to Israel are profound. I mean, I mentioned Russia because it's 1.3 million Russian speakers and Russian citizens there who've migrated since especially the early 1990s. And they are amongst, as even Pepe Escobar, very pro-Putin, would say, they are among the most genocidal inclined of Israeli citizens in fighting in the IDF. South Africa sends troops, mercenaries, kids out of high school. A 22-year-old was exposed yesterday as one of the main snipers of ordinary Palestinians, unarmed, just killing them. His name is Aaron Blaylock, so he'll be sort of followed and maybe prosecuted. There must be hundreds of Indians who go from that pro-Israeli, ruling
and American citizens, many American citizens.
But if I think of the BRICS, even Ethiopians are there. Then I think of Lula supplying 9% of Israel's oil through Petrobras. And I think of India's role with the Adani Group, not only in the privatization of Haifa port, but supply of military equipment. And then, as I mentioned, China with a $20 billion a year trade in the other part of the Haifa port, the seaport there, is privatized by a Shanghai company. And Russia as the main vehicle for the Kazakhstan oil that goes. It's the number 2 supplier, Azerbaijan number 1 supplier of oil, and Russia the number 2 supplier of coal. And it just goes on and on. You could just see Sergei Lavrov in December saying, well, there's a nearly identical reason, those are his words, nearly identical, that Russia invaded Ukraine and that Israel invaded Gaza. The nearly identical reason, denazification. I mean, you go figure. Alexander Dugin, the so-called Putin's brain, was just going on in a delighted way about how the Israelis had assassinated Nasrallah in Beirut, saying we've got to do that. This is a very sick set of rulers in the BRICS Plus who really do seem to identify, I mean, obviously South Africa, not rhetorically, but for profits, for diamonds, for grapes, but especially for coal, with the opportunity to do business with Israelis. We have about 20,000 maybe very active Zionists here. We have a sort of set of institutions and federations, and it's a very interesting battle that goes on even last month over a genocide spin doctoring conference by some leading academics. And I must confess, we were all disgusted that the leading French Marxist, at least in his day, Althusser's writing partner, Etienne Balibar, decided that he would break a boycott. Even Judith Butler asked him to respect, and he spoke at this conference via Zoom. So we're looking at, let's say, a fluid balance of forces where power relations, where the Democratic Alliance, the partners of our ruling party, run by a guy called John Steenhuisen, are pro-Israel. And Steenhuisen himself in March said, I'll try to quote it exactly, when asked about South African-Israeli policy, one side's genocide is another side's freedom fighters. So that's the extent to which we've got maybe a US-style problem. Luckily, the majority of opinion, the majority of power in at least state, and even we're making headway in some of the universities, is towards a humanitarian, solidaristic approach to Israel. And we're just obviously trying to make BDS, as it would, it played such an important role. Labor didn't initially endorse sanctions against products of labor, of course. But then over the time of the early 80s, the FOSATU, Federation of South African Trade Unions, became COSATU. And with that change to the Congress of South African Trade Unions and more ANC influence, then labor endorsed BDS. And that in turn led to a crash in the financial markets in 1985 that sped up the liberation by breaking like a wedge between white capital, financial capital especially, and Anglo-American, on the one hand, and the white racists in Pretoria. And I think it's that spirit of saying, certainly when I gave talks in Gaza, in Ramallah, the standing ovations I got were not because of what I said, but I showed a film by a Berkeley filmmaker, Connie Field. And that film, Have You Heard from Johannesburg, so graphically illustrated how you could eventually bring down a system like South African apartheid with boycott, divestment, sanctions, obviously with a big upsurge of local protests and international awareness. But once you can hit that point, to me, Steve, that point will be Israel's energy supply. Don't take it from me. Shir Havir, probably the greatest expert on how you can weaken the Israeli economy. He's working for BDS out of a German base in exile, an Israeli Jew. He's an exceptionally sharp guy about, well, where do we want to find the Achilles heel? It probably ultimately will be on oil and coal. So getting Lula to withdraw the 9%, South Africa of oil, and South Africa withdrawing what probably now is close to 20% of coal flows that Israel depends upon to run its entire genocidal apparatus. And what we're saying isn't radical anymore, because in July, the International Court of Justice said, because Israel's an illegal, they didn't use the word settler colonial, but they're occupying the Palestinian territories, we should do boycott, sanctions, divestment. That was then affirmed in the UN, apologies, in the UN in September. The vote was at something 143 to 12, with 43 abstentions. So what we're saying is really, I hope, going to be understood as the mainstream and ultimately fastest and least costly in terms of violence way of weakening Israel, hitting its energy supply. So we'll go back to our picket lines against Glencore and its local allies here as soon as we can.
And Softu taking this position on BRICS, is that a big change in the South African labor movement?
Well, I talked to Vavi, Zwelinzima Vavi, who I think is our most forward-thinking and best-known internationalist, so well grounded in so many struggles. And your viewers can look at his speech in Potchefstroom. He's very intent on saying to the BRICS, you are basically Israelis' blessers, right? There was a speech a couple of weeks ago in the UN where Netanyahu held up his map and he said the blessing is all these green countries, and that was Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Ethiopia. Well, that wasn't on, that was a bit south, and it was India, big BRICS countries on the one hand, and then he had the curse, and one of them was BRICS country, Iran. So 9 out of 10 BRICS countries are pro-Israel. I think because Vavi has just come from the BRICS Trade Union Forum, and to be frank, I don't think he'd mind me repeating, we kind of agreed, yeah, those unions are yellow. They're not real fighting unions. And in some countries, China, Saudi Arabia, places like that, you can't really have a union. So in those respects, I think having a working class critique of BRICS, along with an environmental critique, a feminist critique, if you're interested in the fate of women in the Middle East and their struggle for justice, or if you want to take a geopolitical angle and look at whether the BRICS really are speaking, if you want to do international financial reform, you'll have to agree that the BRICS are not anti, but sub-imperial. But then the dilemma is that in a place like this, we've got the biggest parties, which are not just the core of the African National Congress, but the number 3 party, the Economic Freedom, the MK party, sorry, of Jacob Zuma, the 4th party, Economic Freedom Fighters, plus the South African Communist Party, plus the biggest union, the metal workers, plus the biggest trade union, Confederation COSATU, all endorsing BRICS as it is, all endorsing Putin's invasion. Then we're looking at, let's say, a very interesting, let me call it a war of position, as Gramsci would put it, to sort of say, well, what are the lines of argument that we need to get our troops of the working class ready if there is a war movement? And one of those is to, as Vavi put it very clearly, get some ideology, guys. He was very clear at saying, we've lost our politics if some of you working class people think BRICS is your answer.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me, Patrick, and I think that wide-ranging analysis discussion, but it's pertinent to our struggle today in the United States, in South Africa, and globally for working people around the world. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's always great to be with the comrades who watch you, and of course they know two words as well as we do. So let's just remind Mandla
Okay, very
to
take care.
power. Yeah, thanks, comrades.